Thank you, Kelly. I did forget to do that. So the Massachusetts runs on a 2-year legislative cycle. This means that in January of an odd number year, so that was most recently 2021, new bills get filed. They generally need to be introduced by the 3rd week of January of that first year. So bills can still be filed after that date, but it's more difficult. So that's called a late file, and they need special permission by the legislature to be considered. The more complicated explanation of that permission process is that late files require a report by the Committee on Rules of both branches working at the same time, and then approval of 2/3 of the members of both chambers in order to be considered. And I hear you groaning already. I hear you saying, Luke, you already lost me. So don't worry. I'm going to go over this a lot more extensively in a minute. But for now, all you need to know is that we work in a 2-year cycle, and that right now we're at the tail end of that cycle. So a new cycle is going to start in January. So let's talk a little bit about the legislative process itself. I want to mention up front that I greatly simplified this process, and there are exceptions and nuance to a lot of this that I'm leaving out. The first thing that's going to happen in the process is that either a state representative or a state senator is going to file a bill in their chamber. Oftentimes it's the same bill with either the same or slightly different language that gets introduced into both chambers. That's done to try to improve its chance of passage. Sometimes the bills being filed have been filed before and didn't pass last session. Sometimes they're new bills that either the legislators or their staffers have drafted. And sometimes they're bills that advocates like yourself have drafted and asked them to file on their behalf. So something that's worthy to know about Massachusetts is that in Massachusetts, as a citizen, you can ask a legislator to file a bill on your behalf, even if they don't personally support it. Now, the point at which bills are first filed is a point of advocacy. So throughout this training, I'm going to point out different points in the process that as a legislative advocate, which you will be by the end of this, we will be as one, you can have input and advocate for your bill. So the point of advocacy here is the filing itself. So before January, so right now, for example, you could be looking for a senator or a rep to sponsor your bill. You could be drafting legislation for someone to file on your behalf. And I'm going to provide a link a little bit later in this training for how to write legislation if you're feeling super ambitious. So say we got a senator to file our bill. There are exceptions, but generally it will then move on to the next step of the process within the same chamber. After the bill is filed, in general, it's going to get assigned to a joint committee that matches its subject matter. So, for example, the Mass ID bill that has to do with removing the fee to get a state ID, so that has to do with like the RMV, right? That was assigned to the Committee on Transportation. And the RAF bill, which has to do with, money and assistance to avoid eviction, was sent to the Committee on Housing. So that makes sense, right? When the bill's in committee, this is another point of advocacy, right? Because it's at this point that you could be reaching out to your legislators to encourage them to co-sponsor the bill. The more legislators co-sponsor the bill, the clearer it is that the bill has broad statewide support, and it gives the bill a better chance at passing. As a quick note here, it's worth mentioning that pretty much at every stage in this process, the bill can be amended. I'm simplifying this entire process quite a bit and leaving out a lot of nuance and exceptions for the sake of it being a 101. So once the bill is in committee, generally they have until the next year in February to decide what to do with it. There's exceptions to this, and oftentimes extensions are granted to committees that need more time to consider legislation. But in general, they have a little over a year. Once the bill is in committee, the first thing they're going to do is hold a public hearing and issue a report on the bill. The bill hearing is public, and anyone can attend and address the committee. This is another point of advocacy. This is a chance for advocates to submit written testimony to the committee, testify at the reading in person, and or encourage committee members to support the bill. So after the public hearing, the committee starts to consider the bill. While considering it, they have options. They can amend the bill if they want. They can also completely redraft it. Once they have a version that they like, there are essentially three ways a bill can go when it's in committee. It can be reported out favorably, meaning that the committee thinks it ought to pass, unfavorably, which I think you can figure out, or sent to study. Now, on its face, sent to study means that they think more research needs to be put into it before it moves forward. But in practice, it basically means the bill is dead. And it's rare that anything happens with the bill after that. So for the sake of this training, let's assume our fictional bill got reported out favorably out of committee. That bill would then be sent to the chamber floor for what is called a first reading. If it's a bill that has anything to do with money, which most of the policy we advocate for would, it's generally then sent to Ways and Means. So House Ways and Means or Senate Ways and Means. Once in Ways and Means, it gets read again. This is called the second reading. The bill can sit in Ways and Means for as long as it wants, but hopefully it eventually gets placed into what is called the orders of the day. So once it's on the docket for the day, the bill is going to actually be debated in chamber with legislators speaking in favor or against the bill. I think that most of the time when we think of the legislative process, this is what we're thinking of, is a bill being debated on the floor. This is a great point of advocacy. In preparation for this debate, advocates are generally fairly aggressive, contacting both their local legislators to support the bill and also targeting Ways and Means leadership to let them know how much support there is for the bill. Also, bills sometimes sit in Ways and Means for a really long time and never seem to be taken up. This is another point of advocacy and strategy. The more legislators hear from their constituents about the bill, the more they know it should move up on their priority list. If the bill is debated and then gets passed by Ways and Means, it will then be passed to the Committee on Bills. Now, this committee checks for legal issues, technical issues, that kind of thing. It's basically, I'm simplifying things, but it's basically quality assurance for bills. This is called the third reading. It's then sent back to the chamber it originated from, so the House or the Senate floor. It's at this point that a final vote is taken. I think at this point, you can guess that this is another time at which advocating to your legislator and continuing to harass them to support this bill is important. So let's say our fictional bill gets its final vote in the House and passes. The bill would then be sent to the Senate chamber for a vote. Now, the Senate can amend things and change the bill if they want and have their own version of the bill. If this is the case and there's a significant difference between the two bills, then what they're going to form is something called a conference committee to work out the differences and come up with a compromise version. The conference committee is made of members from both the House and the Senate and representatives from both the majority and minority party. So in our legislature, Democrats are the majority party and Republicans are the minority party in both chambers. So advocacy happens in a more targeted way here, reaching out to the specific members of the committee and also your legislators to harass the members of the committee. Now, bills don't always go to conference committee. Sometimes the other chamber will just pass the bill as is. But for the sake of our fictional bill, let's say it did go to conference committee. If the conference committee comes up with a compromise version that they're happy with, then the new bill gets sent back to both chambers for yet another vote. If it passes both chambers, it then goes to the governor to sign it. And the governor has options. Ideally for an advocate, that he, and I'm going to use he only because we still have Charlie Baker right now, he could sign it and it would become a law after 90 days. Yay, right? But he has other options. First, he can send it back with recommendations. So basically saying, I'm only going to pass this if you send me a version without this in it. And then the legislature has an option. They can either make those changes and send it back, or they can leave it exactly as is and send it back. And if either way, it then forces him to make a decision. He has to either sign it, veto it, or let it become law without his signature. So to clarify that point, in order to pass it without a signature, how it works is that if he holds the bill for 10 days during the time the legislature is in session and doesn't do anything with it, then the bill will pass without his signature. However, if that 10 days happens to be when the legislature is not in session and has concluded, it has to be signed to become law. This is a rule called the pocket veto. So speaking of vetoes, he can also veto the entire bill. But fear not. If he vetoes the entire bill, the legislature can still override it. They need to get a 2/3 vote in both chambers to override the veto, but it can be done. Also, a small caveat here is that if it's a money bill, he can also veto just certain line items as well. So I know that I threw a lot at you here. So here is a slightly more visual representation of the process for my fellow visual learners. I'll be sending these slides out later so you can zoom in. And as I noted here, sorry, this chart is for ants. Technology is not always my friend. If you knew how much time it took me to build this chart, you would laugh. So having gone over that process with you, let's see if I can read your mind with this next slide. All right, like what you're thinking right now, what's going through your head. Are you ready? Is that it? Is that, I can't see you guys, but I'm guessing that that's pretty much what's going on in your head right now. And I would like to point out my amazing Photoshop skills, because that is the Massachusetts State House that I Photoshopped in there. So I know that there's nothing particularly simple or straightforward about our legislative process, but once you know how it works, you can use it to your advantage. Just a few small other things that are worth knowing about this process. The legislative cycle is broken up into what is called formal and informal sessions. For the sake of this being a 101 training, basically all you need to know is that most of the processes I just described happen in formal sessions. Legislation can be brought up in informal sessions, but only if it's like a non-controversial bill. And the reason for that is that it's basically called up for a yay or nay vote in informal. And if there's even just one nay vote, the bill's dead. So you're not going to risk one of your like slightly more controversial bills during informals. Another thing to know about advocating for bills is that sometimes there's a larger bill that's likely to pass. Then that opens up our opportunity to get your bill included as an amendment. So for example, this year there was a very large economic development bill that was likely to pass. It didn't yet, but that's beside the point. But advocates were able to take that opportunity to include language from their bill and attach it as an amendment to that bill. Now, amendments still get a vote whether they are accepted and adopted into the bill or not, but if they are, it can accelerate the speed of that bill's passage. Another sort of back route to bill passage is as a budget line item. We're going to cover the budget process in a minute, but depending on the bill you're advocating for, sometimes parts of it can be included in budget items. The Mass ID bill, for example, right? Our bill would eliminate the $25 fee for folks experiencing homelessness to get an ID, and it would let them use their shelter address or anywhere else that they get their services to establish residency. So it was filed as a bill, but also we filed it as a budget line item, since there will be need to be funding to cover the waived fees and to hire more staff to help facilitate the program. So the same bill can have several paths to passage. As promised at the bottom here, this is the link to the state's guide on how to draft legislation. I highly recommend making some lawyer friends to look over what you have written. But if you're feeling super ambitious, this is how to do it. It shows you how to research what's been done before, how to write it, everything you need to know. So say you've been advocating for a bill for a while and you're curious about where it is in the process. You can visit malegislature.gov, and there's a search function, and you can put in the bill number. So if it's from the Senate, it will start with S and then a period and a number. If it's from the House, it'll start with H and a period and a number. Once you put that in the search function, it'll pull up the bill, and this is basically what you'll be looking at. So As you can see here, if you squint a little, it's a little small. This is the Mass ID bill, and we can take it right through the process I just went through, right? So first, it was assigned to the Committee on Transportation in the Senate. It was then reported out favorably and went to Senate Ways and Means. It was placed in the order of the day and debated and had its second reading. They revised it, made a new draft, and that draft was passed and sent for a third reading. It then passed a final vote in the Senate and got sent to House Ways and Means. And that is where the Mass ID bill has been sitting ever since, because it hasn't been taken up for consideration in House Ways and Means yet. Okay, so that was the bill process. I know that was a lot. So shake it off, take a deep breath. I know that was heavy and complicated. So to clear our brains, here is my current favorite joke. Why did Adele cross the road? She wanted to say hello from the other side. Okay. Some of that. There's nothing better for your self-esteem, by the way, to tell a joke in a venue where you have no idea whether anyone laughed. Anyway, are your brains clear and ready for the budget process? Yes. Okay. Let's get into it. So, unlike the bill process, the budget process happens every year, and the budget is being prepared for the next year. So this January, we're going to be working on the fiscal year 2024 budget for the state. There are also supplemental budgets that get passed throughout the year, but for the sake of this training, we'll be focusing on like the primary budget. And as a note here, I am obviously greatly oversimplifying this process for the sake of this training, and it should be implied that there's nuance and exceptions for a lot of this. So that's it. The first step in the process is that the sitting governor releases his budget. I say his because Charlie Baker, his budget recommendations in the first few weeks of January. It contains everything that the governor thinks we should be spending our money on and how much money we have to spend as a state. So this governor's budget is then submitted to the House. It then goes to House Ways and Means. The House considers the budget and they add and amend anything they want, and they create their own draft. This has to be done by the second Wednesday in May. This draft is then amended and debated on the House floor. Once it passes, they send their budget, which is again, elements of the governor's budget and elements of their own budget, into the House budget. They send their budget to the Senate. Did I say budget enough times? Senate Ways and Means then reviews the House budget, holds its own hearings, and drafts its own version of the budget. So their budget goes to the Senate floor and is amended and drafts a final version of the Senate budget. This happens between April and May. So both House and Senate versions of the budget also have a process where after their version is released, amendments can be adopted or rejected into their budgets. So by June, we have final versions of the Senate and the House budgets. And at that point, since there is almost always a lot of difference between the two, a conference committee is formed to go over it. This works just like the bills. It's bipartisan. It has members and leadership from both chambers, and they work out the differences between the two budgets to release a compromise version of the budget. So then this compromise version is then voted on, yay or nay, in both chambers. Once it passes, it's then sent to the governor. So the governor has 10 days to review the budget. That's 10 business days, I believe. Much like bills, he can veto line items. He can reduce proposed appropriations in return for amendment, any wording he wants to see revised. But all of that can be overridden with a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate. Some other random things to know. And again, this is greatly simplified, but budget line items are lines that appropriate money to certain things. So they get grouped into general sections in the budget by topic and what office they fall under. So a housing line item might go under the Executive Office of Health and Human Services in the budget. So if you decide to be really thorough and you want to look through the budget to see if the program you like got funding, this is how you're going to set apart looking for what part it's in. So that's the basic process, which seems pretty simple, but this is what it often feels like for advocates. So the reason the budget season can be so wild for advocates is that very often a budget will be released and there will be a deadline to submit amendments that is either the very same day or within just a few days. So advocates have a very limited time to review the budget, see what was or was not included, and submit amendments. So if you're trying to get funding through an amendment because it wasn't included in the budget, you have to find a legislator that will file an amendment for you, and you have to do it in a hurry. So this is work that we generally do ahead of time. We have the language ready, we have everything set up with a legislator so that if we need to make an amendment, we can do it fast. So this is a more visual representation of the timeline of this process for you. In terms of timeline, the fiscal year in Mass is July 1st to June 30th. So we are currently in fiscal year 23 that just started this last July. And we will be planning the fiscal year 24 budget starting in January. You did it. Also, why did none of these cartoon people have faces? I also want to know why this one looks like there's like posing for a hip hop album. I don't have answers for any of that. So now that we've gotten through the really dense stuff, it's time for the fun stuff, or at least I think it's fun. So for the sake of the next couple of sections, let's pose a real life example, right? I worked for a while as a program manager in the family shelter system. One of my former case managers is here today. Hi, Libby. As a part of that job, I oftentimes had families that had a decent amount of income and would be able to move out of shelter and into housing if they had like a little bit of help. They made too much money to qualify for some of the vouchers and subsidies, but not enough to float rent without some kind of help. So where would I start if I wanted to advocate for something that could help those families? Well, my first step would be to start doing some Googling. I would want to be looking for what orgs are around that do work in housing and homelessness policy, since the issue that I want to work with is in that area. Now, there are lots of them that all lead different areas of housing policy work. But for the sake of this example, we're going to stick with my own organization, Mass Coalition for the Homeless. So let's say I do some Googling and I end up on the coalition's webpage. The first thing I'm going to look for is their public policy page. You can see ours here with our actual drop-down menu, although we are updating our entire website, so don't judge us too hard. Once you're on the public policy page, almost every org is going to have a policy priorities list. And this is going to tell you all of the bills and budget items that this org is advocating for and campaigns they're involved in. They also tend to list them in like order of importance to the org. And so the ones at the top are generally the ones that org is taking a lead on. So in our example of the families that I want to advocate for, say I look through the coalition's list and the bill that catches my eye is a bill about home base. So home base is currently a program that assists folks with costs relating to getting out of shelter, families specifically. It helps with the cost of movers, furniture, first, last, and security, and it can also be used to help subsidize the cost of rent. But in its current form, it has a cap of $10,000 a year, and it only lasts a year. So for this reason, most of the families that I serve are hesitant to use it as a subsidy, because even if they use it to provide, say, $1,000 of rent a month, it wouldn't even last a full year. So then what? What if they've not increased their income enough at that point to maintain housing on their own? But the proposed bill would extend the program so that it could be utilized up to 2 years and have a cap of $20,000. So as I'm reading this interests me, right? Because I think this would really help some of the families I serve. So now what? There are lots of great ways to get involved with that campaign. Generally, an organization's website is going to provide you ways to reach out. So on our website, you can contact us directly to see how to be involved in the campaign. You can attend advocacy meetings like this one, Housing and Benefits, to see where the legislation currently sits and how you can get involved. You can reach out to the organization and see what they recommend. Or you can advocate to the legislators on your own. And so this is what we're going to cover next. So say you have your issue and you have legislation that you want to advocate for. What's next? Well, you're going to want to reach out to your legislators. So I'm going to be covering who you should be targeting, how to find them, how to prepare for your meeting, and what to expect in that meeting. Now, the very first step in this process is to find out who your legislators are. So once again, we are on the MA legislature website. I'm going to give you a caveat that it is super slow and it has a really fun error message, but it's also very informative. I went ahead and I plugged in my own address to find on their Find My Legislator tool. And as you can see, my senator is Jason Lewis and my rep is Kate Lipper-Garabedian. So for the sake of this training, let's focus a little bit more on Senator Lewis for a moment. Again, sorry for the small font here, but so once I've clicked on Senator Lewis, there's just a ton of information available to me here. I can see his contact information if I want to set up a meeting with his office, all of the bills he sponsored and co-sponsored, committees that he serves on, and what position he holds on those committees. A biography, which I do recommend reading. Sometimes they're funny and they always humanize them a little for you, so it's not so intimidating to meet them. And a photo gallery. A part that I want to point out here a little bit is the committees. So if I was advocating for a bill that ended up in the Committee on Education, for example, I might target Senator Lewis, my advocacy, even if I'm not his constituent, because he's the chair of that committee. Mm-hmm. Also, you can click on any of the committees there and see everyone who serves on it. You can also, on that website, look up the committees themselves and see everyone that's involved and target those people. So for the sake of the home-based bill example, though, I would advocate to Senator Lewis because I'm in his district. It doesn't hurt at all that he happens to be leadership in Ways and Means. So now that I know my legislators, what now? Well, start by researching them a little. It's a good idea to know if they already support the bill or similar bills, or they have supported the bill in the past. Also, what their general track record is on these types of issues. It's good to know that going in so that you're not advocating for something that they already did. The next step is that you're going to want to go about the business of making an appointment. So if you're working with an organization, they can do this for you. I'm always happy to set up legislative appointments for any of you, or you can do it on your own. You can email or call the legislative office. You can just mention that you would like to be connected to whomever does the scheduling. Tell them who you are. If you're working with an org, mention that, and tell them what you want to discuss with the legislator. So with our example, where I was still a shelter program manager, if I was reaching out, it would kind of look like this. I would say that I'm reaching out in conjunction with the Mass Coalition for the Homeless, and that I would like to advocate for the home-based bill, and I would include the bill number, and I would tell the staffers that I would love to speak with the legislator about why it's so important to me. Now, keep in mind that you might actually end up meeting with staffers and not the legislator themselves, and that is totally fine. Sometimes it's even better. They will relay what you have said and they will fill the person in. You might get scheduled for a Zoom meeting, or they might want to meet in person. It's kind of weird times right now. Couple of pointers. So before the meeting, practice what you want to say. We'll get into what that should include in a minute, but practice is good so you're not as nervous. If the meeting is in person, get there early. There's often security to get through. The room might change at the last minute. Parking might be difficult. It's just easier to account for that and get there early than to be on time and actually end up late. It is also important to have a mindset going into these meetings that you want to be heard, but also be open to what they have to say. Now, as far as the actual content of what you're going to say, personal stories are the most impactful by far. We hear this constantly from legislators. Personal stories really humanize an issue and make it real for them. So for my example of the families I serve, I would always lean towards lived experience speakers serving as their own advocates. So what do I mean by that, right? To prepare for this meeting, I might reach out to a family I've served that this would be really helpful if it passed, and ask them to write out a statement about their situation and how it would help. Or maybe they'd like to come along and speak to the legislator themselves. Or maybe they'd give me permission to share their story. Now, a big caveat to this is that this must be done in a trauma-informed way that does not re-traumatize folks that are still actively in crisis. Compensation is a really good idea. Respect for their time is important. But bringing unheard voices to the table can be really empowering for everyone involved. But say you can't do that, right? There is also value in my own story. I can speak to my own experience as a manager and how I think this policy change would impact the families that I serve. Another super helpful element to what you present is data. If you can present both personal impact and show the problem the legislation will impact through data, you're making a super powerful argument. So once you've relayed a personal story and you've shown some data, the next step is to link it directly to the legislation that you're advocating for. Make sure you mention where the bill is in the process and if there are any deadlines coming up, and then make an actionable request. So in our example, let's say that the bill just got into, it was just introduced and it just got into Ways and Means in the House. If I was meeting with Rep. Lipper Garabedian, I might ask that she co-sponsor the bill and advocate to House Ways and Means leadership that it ought to pass. I for sure would try to get her to commit to something. So once you've done all that, you're going to want to listen to what they have to say about their stances on things. After all of that, when it feels natural, it is usually helpful to summarize with them all that you've said, all that they've said, what the next action steps are for both of you, and make sure that you thank them for the time that they took to meet with you. It's usually helpful as well to follow up like 3 to 5 business days later. You're going to thank them again for their time, reiterate everything that happened and everything that you said and that they said. Also, if you said you were going to provide something like data or information, that's a really good time to provide that information. The most important thing to remember is that legislators are just human beings. They got into this because they want to help their community. And even the most jaded politicians can be moved into action by the right story. So only you can provide your perspective. Would it be easier for you if I advocated on your behalf? Sure. But then they wouldn't get your story. And you never know if yours is the one that's going to make a difference. So some tips and tricks and typical responses we see from legislators. I already voted for a bill just like that. Or here are the other bills that I have co-sponsored around housing, right? Well, this is a great chance to thank them very much for that and for all the great work that they've done, and then mention future legislation that they might be interested in, or encouraging them to continue to support these issues. They might tell you, that's not a problem in my district. Well, you're there because you're their constituent. So you are in their district. So that is why having these personal stories and data available is pretty important, because you can show that it is, in fact, an issue in their district. Speaking of data, like I said, it's great to have. If you don't have any on you, that's okay. Just give them a time frame for when you will have that information for them, and then hit up the org that you are associated with now and be like, hey, do you have any data on this? Because probably we do. So when it comes to these meetings, personal stories are probably the most important part, but data is that extra little spice that really drives your point home. So now you've listened to me speak for an ungodly amount of time, and I need to drink some water, and I think we need another voice. So I would like to welcome to the training, Mark Martinez. Mark is currently a housing staff attorney at the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute, but prior to that, Mark was the legal counsel and budget director for Senator Pat Jehlen for a number of years. So I've invited Mark here today to give us kind of an insider's perspective from the other side of advocacy. So welcome, Mark.
Hello.
I have a couple of questions I think you can address. So,
Yeah.
first, when you were a staffer in a legislative office, what did you find to be super effective things that advocates did, and what was like not as effective?
Yeah. So a lot of what you said is true. Well, I think everything you said is true. I want to be clear. No, I mean, I think, really narrowing in on personal stories is really effective. And the other thing that I want to, quickly kind of reiterate and emphasize is, this idea that, meeting with staffers is better than meeting with the elected official. And I agree, right? And maybe I'm biased because I was a staffer and took these meetings, but listen, your legislator, depending, right, if it's a senator, represents 180,000 people, right, and has this massive, right, and has to be responsible for voting on every piece of policy, and nobody's an expert in everything, right? My boss, Senator Jehlen, was an expert in a lot of things, and was, extremely intelligent, but could not possibly be an expert in everything. It's not possible. And so, she really relied on staff to have various levels of expertise. And so, when you're speaking with staffers, you're generally speaking to the person with the most expertise on that topic. And so that's really helpful. And then the other thing, that I have found with staffers is if you could get a staffer engaged, right? Like, we know best how to get our bosses engaged on an issue. Right. So if you can get us hooked, we're going to know how to get our bosses hooked a lot better than you will, just because we know that. Right. We talk to them every day, and we know kind of the buttons to press if you get us on board. And so that's really important. And, I think the thing that is most effective, right, really is it's the hard ask. Right. I think the biggest mistake that people make when I would meet with them is they would come in and they would tell me this thing that they're really passionate about, and then they would just leave. Right. And they would not tell me what they wanted me or my boss to do, which is really important, right? Because we don't actually know, right? We can make assumptions, but our assumptions could be wrong. And our assumption could be the thing that's not the most helpful. And, truth be told, it also then makes it a lot more difficult for you to hold your legislator accountable after the fact. Right. Because if you just come in and say, we want you to support this bill, that can mean a million different things. Right, that could mean co-sponsoring it. That could mean writing testimony in front of the committee. That could be providing testimony. That could be talking to a committee chair. That could be, sending a sign-on letter. Right, support can look like so many different things, and if you are not specific on what you want, it's really hard to hold your legislators accountable, especially the ones that maybe don't 100% align with what you're asking. And so I think personal stories are really important. I think having a specific ask is really important. And also remembering that, staffers are human beings and we have really busy days. And I'm not a staffer anymore, but I forget that sometimes. Staffers, right, our days are usually jam-packed with back-to-back meetings. And so, being concise and to the point and knowing what you want is going to get you the best result in those meetings.
Awesome. Do you have any other tips and tricks and pointers for our future legislative advocates? Is there like a better time period to be reaching out that isn't so busy?
I mean, right, there are certainly times that, we're busy, right, budget season is really busy, but we just kind of expect that. So, if you're advocating for something in the budget, right, as much foresight as you can have, the better off you're going to be, right? If you wait until the day of amendment filing or the day of debate, we're going to be running around all day, and it's going to be really hard to kind of nail us down. And so, to the extent that you can have some foresight on things like that, that's really important. The other thing that I want to tack on that I like to talk about a lot is, right, especially during the pandemic, email became far like the kind of predominant way that people contacted us. Right before the pandemic, we'd have a lot of people just stroll into the office, and I don't know what it's like at the State House right now. I know obviously some people are operating on hybrid schedules, but I don't go into the building, so I'm not sure what meeting with legislators is like at this moment in time. But, on the email campaign front, I think we've all seen those, click here and, we'll send an email to your legislator right away. And, that one click kind of convenience is really nice. But what I can tell from the other side is one actually personally typed out email with a story and an ask for a response back is far more effective than 30 form emails. Because those form emails, sometimes they get messed up and we get emails from people that aren't actually our constituents. And, understand why they're attractive because we're all really busy in our lives and it's nice to click a button and go. It doesn't show the same level of kind of commitment to an idea or an issue as someone taking the time. And even if you use that form email and just throw in a couple sentences of your own saying, here's why this is personally really important to me, you're far more likely to get a response. You're far more likely to get your legislator to move on an issue. And the other thing that I will always say is whether it's a phone call or an email, always ask to have someone respond back to you. Because that's another thing. If you don't ask for a specific response, most offices aren't going to go out of their way to reach back out to you. But if you were like, hello, I'm your constituent, and I would like to hear back from you on this topic, it's going to be a lot more likely that they do respond, and it's going to be a lot easier for you to like call back in a week and say, hello, still waiting on that response that I asked for. Right. And some of it is offices get really busy and things fall through the crack, and that's true. But others, you just kind of have to force them to be responsive to you, which is unfortunate, but the truth. Not the case if you live in Somerville and you're represented by Pat Jehlen. She's great all the time.
I agree. I concur. I love Pat Jehlen. Okay. Thank you so much, Mark. That was illuminating even for me. That's good to know. So, okay, moving to our last section. Thank you for making it this far. Look, more faceless people. I know you guys are really excited about that. So besides meeting with your legislator, right, what are some ways that you can get involved? I'm so glad you asked. So first off is letter writing, sign-on letters, and petitions. So we use these a lot at the coalition. So if you followed my advice and you found an org doing this work and connected with them, chances are you're going to be connected to these kind of campaigns. Oftentimes, this is, like Mark was saying, as easy as plugging in your address into an online form, and then it auto-generates who your legislators are and automatically sends a letter on your behalf. These are called individual sign-on letters. There are also organizational sign-on letters. These are letters written by an organization that other organizations sign on to that is then sent to legislative leadership, the governor, or other targets. So you can write your own letter to your legislator as well, or you can call them. Also, as a note, we do use those forms a lot, and I'm gonna be promoting a couple of them at the end that automatically send a letter, but it also is a text box, and you can also always add your own input into that letter. So you can add your personal story right into that form letter. So you could also write an op-ed or opinion piece for your local paper. If you're interested in learning how to write an op-ed, feel free to reach out to me via email. And it's luke@mahomeless.org. And I can share with you a plethora of resources about how to go about doing that if you're interested. Also, as mentioned before, you can participate in the legislative process itself by submitting testimony in written form or verbally testifying at bill hearings and legislative hearings. You can also attend rallies, protests, press conferences. Again, if you're involved with an org, these kind of things happen often. There are events that generally you can go to. We have our own legislative action day every year, which is really fun, on top of some rallies and events and things. You can also use your social media platform. You can use it to raise awareness on the issue that you're passionate about, as well as spread links for sign-on letters and advocacy actions to other people in your state. You can volunteer at an org to participate in phone banks or do bill fact sheet drops at the State House. I don't know if Charlie's here today, but Charlie's one of our volunteers that does runs with us at the State House all the time. So hi, Charlie, if you're here. You can also join an advocacy group. So I'd like to take a second here to plug this group that you are currently in. Housing and Benefits, as I know a lot of you have never been here before. So generally at Housing and Benefits, I will arrange a couple of speakers every month, and they will speak on either resources for folks experiencing homelessness, benefits that they could get, be applying for, legislation that organizations are working on that maybe we're not the lead on, legislation that has passed, and they tell us how we got there, how they succeeded in this legislation. So there's usually a couple of speakers, and then also every month we will let you know where everything is that we're the lead on in the legislative process. So you'll get those legislative updates every month, plus any events that I'm planning, like a rally or a phone bank or anything like that. Like I plan on using this group to help plan those events. So feel free to come every month. It's the final Friday of the month every month. So yeah, join us. But even if you don't join here, if your interest in policy is not housing, for example, like most orgs have some type of group that meets and does advocacy work. So go forth and get involved. So I would be absolutely remiss if I got you all fired up, ready to do advocacy and didn't give you anything to do. So here are a couple of campaigns that the coalition that we're currently working on. So formal sessions are over for the year right now. We're in informal sessions, but we have these two campaigns that we're focusing on at the moment. So the first is RAFT. So as you may know, for the majority of the clients that most of us serve, the Residential Assistance for Families in Transition Program, or RAFT, is the primary method of avoiding eviction. It's also one of the only methods that tenants can use upstream to maintain housing stability. So we're in a program landscape where clients often have to be like already drowning to receive help. RAFT has been one of the few programs that clients could access early enough that they could avoid losing the roof over their head when they knew they weren't going to have enough money to pay rent. So you can understand our concern when we were informed that the Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD, has introduced a new rule as of this last August 1st, 2022, that requires clients to have a notice to quit to be eligible for RAFT. So this is problematic for several reasons. Often, by the time arrears have risen to the level of a notice to quit, clients are so far behind that RAFT wouldn't fully cover what they owe anymore. Also, the notice to quit is more than just a letter. It's a legal document. And when a landlord serves it, it greatly increases the probability that they will continue to pursue further legal action against the tenant. Also, at issue is that often a tenant who receives a notice to quit will vacate the unit without seeking out any financial assistance because they're not familiar with the process and they think the letter is an eviction in and of itself. This policy also doesn't take into account that often landlords will harass and threaten tenants for past due rent, but not file a notice to quit. And that would leave those tenants ineligible to receive RAFT assistance. So the advocacy actions that we have to offer you today are twofold. So one is an organizational sign-on. We have drafted a letter with our friends from CHAPA and MLRI that calls on the legislature to include language in the FY22 closeout budget or some other vehicle that would expressly prohibit DHCD from requiring a notice to quit. I'm going to provide a link to the Google form that you can pass along to whomever in your organization has the authority to sign on behalf of your org. Now that's going to be like your executive director, your director of policy, someone in a leadership position, like not just anyone can sign on behalf of an organization. And the second is an individual sign on. And I'm going to put that link in the chat at the end of this. And in our follow-up email that I'm going to send out to all of you that will have this information in it. And that's a form like we were talking about that you can put in your name and your address. It's automatically going to pull up your legislators for you. It's automatically going to target leadership. And it has like a form letter. And you can add in anything, any information that you want to add into that letter before you sign it. Also, this campaign is going to be ongoing. So if you come back to Housing and Benefits further down the line, I plan on organizing a rally around this and also a day of action, like a Twitter storm, phone banking, group harassment campaign. And this group's going to be a key part of the planning for those events. So come back and find out more about RAFT. The other campaign is one we discussed earlier, and that is the Mass ID bill. As we went over, it passed, it went all the way through the process in the Senate. In fact, it's passed the Senate 3 sessions in a row. So if you're paying attention, sessions are 2 years, so that's 6 years. So it has passed the Senate 3 sessions in a row and is now sitting in House Ways and Means. Mass ID is a little different in that we think even in informal, this bill is non-controversial enough that it could pass. But legislators need to know that it's important enough to folks to either put it up for a vote or attach it to something. So we have a letter that's very similar to the other one where you can just plug in your information and it'll send things to your legislators. And I will give you that link as well. So this is my last slide. I would like to point out my wonderful Photoshop skills here because that kitten, for some reason, was carrying a weapon, and I thought that's violent. So now he has a little bouquet of flowers. So I'm going to, at this point, stop sharing and end the recording if I can figure out how. There we go. Okay.